One thing is clear, environment is a very dynamic subject. Most of the questions are somewhere related to some news item which has appeared in the news, where we saw 19 out of 57 questions, and in 2024, in fact, 7 questions came directly from species and their various behavioral patterns. Question was directly from a current affairs news article which appeared in the Hindu. But is it our, see, देखो, हमारा काम ये नहीं है कि मैं दिखा दूं कि ये देखो ये हमारे सोर्स से आया है. What is important is how do you know that this particular question can be approached even if I have not read that particular news article from the. So essentially, जो 80% of the marks आपका reflect होगा exam में, वो 20% of the content से ही होगा. Hello everyone. Before we move into the topic of the webinar this week, let us learn about a particular principle. Many of you must have heard of this particular principle. It is called as the Pareto Principle, which says that 80% of your consequences comes from 20% of your causes. Now, इसको अगर हम अपने UPSC preparation में superimpose करें, तो mostly अब देखना जो last 20-25 दिनों में आप पढ़ोगे, उसी मेमोरी के बेसिस पे स्पेशली प्रीलिम्स आप अटेम्प्ट करने का कोशिश करोगे. तो एसेंशियली जो 80% ऑफ द मार्क्स आपका रिफ्लेक्ट होगा एग्जाम में, वो 20% ऑफ द कंटेंट से ही होगा. एंड दिस पर्टिकुलर थिंग becomes even more important and comes out in a very broader and effective manner in environment. If we see the question from environment in the last 10-11 years, you'll see constantly an average of 15 or around 15 questions have been constantly asked by UPSC. Somewhat so that it is equivalent to a history or a polity or a economics. But environment में एक जो बच्चों का major problem या issue होता है कि most of the question feels new when they go to the examination hall and try to attempt it. We will be exploring why is it so and how do we tackle it. Now, for tackling it, we need to understand how UPSC goes across asking questions in environment. One thing is clear, environment is a very dynamic subject. Most of the questions are somewhere related to some news item which has appeared in the news the previous year or the previous 2 years. Now, going back to the subject environment, if we see, there are essentially 5 areas, and mostly biodiversity, pollution, and laws and acts are the 3 areas where UPSC has constantly focused in its prelims. In this particular webinar, we are going to deal with one very important section of amongst these 5 subparts of the subject environment. And that part is biodiversity. Now, after a very thorough analysis and going across current affairs and static books, one pattern which is particularly emerged in the environment part is biodiversity. Now, it is very surprising that in the year 2020 to 2023, 57 questions have come from environment, out of which 19 questions have been particularly appeared from this topic, that is biodiversity. So in this webinar, we are going to deal with one subpart of biodiversity, that is the species specific questions. If you see the UPSC questions, there have been 3 kinds of questions from this area. One has been type identification, one is the habitat identification, and the third one is behavioral pattern. Now, what do these 3 types of questions actually mean? And how are you going to approach these questions? This is what we are going to go across in detail in our next webinar. Now, once we deal with the questions and the areas which we should cover, we are going to tackle one of the most and one of the prominent problems which aspirants have in environment, that is a multiplicity of sources. You have a Lakshmikant for polity. Now you have certain books for economics. You have a spectrum for modern history. Similarly, you cannot say कि ये book पढ़ लो और environment हो जाए. I have seen toppers and people who have got ranks scour through down-to-earth magazines, read about environment from the Hindu, Indian Express, go back to your biology book, then go back to the geography book. How does one get across this? If we see species wala, which is going to be the major topic of discussion in this pre-webinar, you will see down to earth a number of news items across various species have come over the past 1 year. So much so that if you see between 1st January and 3rd January, there are 5 different species cutting across biodiversity, taxonomy, and behavioral patterns. Is it possible for an aspirant to read each and every aspect? How do we make the path easy? Because we just saw in one of the previous slides that there have been 19 out of 57 questions which have come from this particular subtheme. Now, going ahead, we will also see the various questions that UPSC has taken from current affairs with respect to species. One example I'll show you here about the honeybee dance. This was the most talked about question, one of the most talked about questions that year. Now, this question was directly from a current affairs news article which appeared in the Hindu. But is it our, see, देखो हमारा काम ये नहीं है कि मैं दिखा दूं कि ये देखो ये हमारे सोर्स से आया है. What is important is how do you know that this particular question can be approached even if I have not read that particular news article from the Hindu. Similarly, we will be taking one more question and discussing its current affairs genesis, where a pregnant wild elephant had died in Kerala after Crackerfield pineapple exploded. In that year, a direct question came regarding Indian elephants, which was the static base of the current affairs news which appeared that year. Now, going forward, we will be again exploring our way of how to approach species specific question, and we will be launching this particular booklet which is going to be very effective for handling species specific questions. The importance of species specific question we saw in the initial slides, where we saw 19 out of 57 questions, and in 2024 in fact 7 questions came directly from species and their various behavioral patterns. So I hope I see a lot many aspirants in the next webinar, because this is going to be a very important webinar from this year's prelims perspective. Thank you.